I was remembering that the last time we were outside in this space back in the fall, the winter almost, I broke my finger on the way here. I had always looked at people replacing flat tires, fixing them, and wondered why the car doesn't fall over. And it turns out sometimes they fall over. It just fell just a little bit on my finger, and it just a little bit broke my finger. I was okay. I didn't need to go to the hospital, but it was one of those times where I was grateful to live in a place and a time where there are emergency medical services if one needs to call on them. I grew up in a world where 911 and the existence of ambulances was something to be taken for granted, but paramedics haven't been around as long as one might imagine. And before there were paramedics, it wasn't always clear whose job it was to show up and bring you to the hospital if you were sick or injured. Before the system we have now, there really wasn't a system. Sometimes it was the firefighters who would show up, take you to the hospital. In some places, it was the local funeral home, which I'll be honest, doesn't feel great. I can only imagine having some horrible accident while fixing my car tire and hearing someone in my housemate family yell out, "Matt's down, call the funeral home." I don't love it. More often than not, though, it was the police who drove sick or injured people to the hospital. But the problem is that neither the police, nor firefighters, nor funeral homes, certainly, had any medical training, not beyond basic first aid. Their only job was to get you to the hospital as fast as possible so that someone who knew what they were doing could then start their work. This was an ongoing health disaster in our country, as you can imagine. In the mid-60s then, the federal government published this paper about it, addressing the problem, or at least naming the problem. And they found that at least 50,000 people a year died on their way to the hospital in ways that could have been prevented if they'd got help sooner. Trained medical help. And publicizing this information shamed the government into spending way more money on this problem to address it. When this new funding became available, there was a sort of Avengers-style gathering. A gathering of badass activists in Pittsburgh. A community organizer, a man named Phil Halen, brought together a bunch of folks. He met up with a group called Freedom House, that was an organization run by African Americans serving their neighborhood by bringing healthy food to people that didn't have access to it. And then he brought in a doctor, a trained professional, with a particular interest in emergency medicine. Together, this Avengers-style group did together what none of them could have done on their own, and they formed something called Freedom House Medics, the very first emergency medical service in the country to be staffed by people who actually had medical training. This group contracted with the city of Pittsburgh as the first civilian paramedics, and they saved 200 lives in their first year. And the model of Freedom House was then expanded to nearly every other city in the nation, saving countless lives since then, and perhaps just important, changing our whole understanding of healthcare. They created a new kind of job, they created a jobs training program for people that needed the work, and they created a whole new branch of medicine. But because nearly all of the first paramedics in Pittsburgh were African American men, the police fought them every step of the way. The police would regularly try to keep the paramedics from providing help to people who were in need, leaving injured people on the side of the road. But in spite of the police harassment, Pittsburgh defunded the police, at least in this specific way. They took a part of their job, a significant part of their job, and they handed it over to people who were better equipped to do it. Pittsburgh and every other city has been safer ever since. Someday, I hope, Someday, I believe that mediators and counselors, social workers and mental health professionals, and community organizers will have taken all of those roles away from the police and handed them off to people that are better trained to do them. And when that time comes, if there are any police left, I don't think they'll have much left to do. When that time comes, I imagine that the idea of going back to the way it is now will seem just as absurd as giving the police the job of trained paramedics again. The story of Freedom House answers this question that is central to nearly all of our political debates and central to our religious lives as well. The question, how do we care for each other? They answered it by naming that collective problems require collective solutions, which means that every single one of us has a role to play. In this case, it was the federal government bureaucrats, bless them, who approved the funding. It was the Freedom House team delivering groceries who had a van and knew how to get around their neighborhood and take care of people in need. It was the doctor with technical skills, and it was the community organizer that brought them all together to do what none of them could do alone. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone's role was made more significant by doing it in community, in collaboration with others. Together, they answered the question, how do we take care of each other in a way that it had never been answered before? All for one, and one for all. There's another story, a similar story I want to tell you. In the early days of the United States, nobody thought it was the government's job to fund firefighters. This seems odd now, but the first volunteer firefighting brigades that formed to meet this important need of putting out fires were in some ways like a private insurance company. If you paid them, they would fight a fire at your house. But if you didn't pay, they'd watch it burn. It got worse from there, though. That was just the beginning of it. In some cases, the brigades worked more like a mix of old fraternal orders and street gangs, like if Masons were a violent mob. They formed around awful bonds of race and class, and they fought each other for territory and market share. A book called How the Irish Became White describes it this way. With firefighting as a pretext, the private brigades fought continuously for control over territory, and arson was highest on their list of weapons. These are firefighters, remember? One of their favorite tactics, and this is my favorite part, was to set a fire near the territory of a rival brigade and then hide out and wait for them to show up and beat the heck out of them when they got there. So the brigades would just fight each other while the building burned down. A report in 1953 said, "There is scarcely a case of riot brought before the courts that has not its origin in the firefighting brigades." For some time, this was the best answer our society could come up with for how do we take care of each other when someone's house is on fire. This was the violence of the privatized brigades before the government took over. You'll notice that in all of the polarized debates we have about all kinds of political issues, and particularly about government regulation, for some reason, no one ever suggests that we re-privatize firefighters back to the racist mob violence that was their origins. Let's remember this history, and let's imagine a new future as we ask ourselves, how will we take care of each other? 200 years ago, when mainstream Christianity had declared a false binary between the saved and the damned, between those bound for heaven and those who went to hell, Universalists at the time responded with the heretical belief that everyone was saved, that everyone would eventually reside together in heaven, that no one, not a single one of us, was unredeemable. Later on, humanism converged with universalism, and we ended up with an even higher standard, one that said we shouldn't wait for the next life for salvation, that we can work to save each other in this life, that we shouldn't wait for the next life. We shouldn't wait till we get to the hospital or the funeral home to start treatment. We can start taking care of each other right away. The ongoing health disaster of the global pandemic is a question of how we will take care of each other. The right to abortion is a question of how we will take care of each other. There are better answers to this question than we see around us today. Better answers by far. I believe that the trajectory of humankind is a painfully slow process to stop fighting each other while our neighbors' homes are on fire, and instead learning to put out the fires that are plaguing our people together. As Adrian Rich said in our chalice lighting, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. I have to cast my lot with those who, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." I love that Rich starts by acknowledging the limits of individualism, all that I cannot save. But by casting our lot with others, nothing less than the whole world is reconstituted. Dear ones, how will we care for each other? Let's remember our history and let's imagine new futures together. We'll keep on loving boldly to widen the circle till it embraces all the living. We'll keep on singing loudly to root ourselves in community and connection, to do together what we could not do alone. And we'll keep on moving forward toward a world that we know is possible, where no one is left behind on the side of the road. May it be so, and may we make it so. Amen.